Welcome, listeners of the Artistic Foodies, to a special bonus content for our Star Wars episode. In this bonus content, we present to you the full interview that we had with Sayyidi Dr. Ali Hussain about Star Wars and the spirituality of it. Hope that you enjoy this. Of course, check out more episodes on the Artistic Foodies on Spotify or wherever you get your episode. Enjoy. Today we have with us a special guest, Dr. Ali Hussain, who is an artist and a very spiritually focused artist who, at least to me, exemplifies this quote that I heard about art. I'm trying to remember which artist said it. He said that art is a lie. All art is a lie that brings you closer to the truth. And so Dr. Ali has picked up the oud. He's become amazing at that. He's a musician. He's a published author, poet, and everything in between. I mean, to sum it all, he is an artist. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Ali.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Abbas, it's a pleasure to see you once again, albeit from a distance, but still, it's a pleasure to be with you here. And that's a big honor of a quote. It's almost as honorable as when I got my certificate in artificial intelligence and my department had said, now you are officially artificially intelligent.
That's fantastic. You got to collect all these honors somewhere.
Yeah, man.
This makes for a great bio.
He's artificially intelligent.
Yeah, he's got a certificate to prove it. So, alhamdulillah, we have you on here to talk about Star Wars and Islam. My co-host, Irfan, who's been running this podcast with me, in fact, he wrote this article in 2005 that's been reposted many, many times since then. And it drew a lot of interesting corollaries between Star Wars and Islam. So we're going to get into a few of the metaphors. We're going to get into a few of the similarities. Of course, 2005, at the time of that writing, the Star Wars universe was a lot smaller than it is now. So it's a beautiful opportunity to revisit it now that we have a few more movies. We got Rogue One, the holy city of Jeddah. We've got the Mandalorian, who's very strict about hijab, so we can revisit some of these Islamic themes. And Irfan, I want to let you lead with any questions that you might have or any reflections from the piece that you wrote then. And then inshallah, we'll just see where the force guides us to in this conversation.
2005. That was right around the time of Revenge of the Sith, right? When that came out.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was after the last of the prequels, I believe. So. Yeah, a lot of stuff has happened since then, but the funny thing is, obviously I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I grew up with the original movies, of course. The first movie I think I saw in a theater was The Return of the Jedi, 1983. Shout out to all the 80s kids. So I'm one of those old guys. But I wrote that piece, and then it got published in a couple of magazines, like Q News magazines in the UK, nice. And a lot of people read it. And then obviously on the internet, people like to just copy paste and put it onto their own blogs, and they put their own name on it. They didn't, never gave me credit for writing that, and it's kind of funny. So I've seen it all over the place, but it was fun to write that. And obviously I talked to a lot of people in online, and as well as people I knew who were into Sufism and religion. And obviously it's pretty obvious when you watch especially the original movies, it's pretty obvious that there's a lot of Islamic themes in there, and there's a clear, especially like the original Obi-Wan Kenobi, he's wearing like the North African kind of cloaks, and he has a beard, and he's kind of like a typical Sufi person. But the great thing about it is that the way that George Lucas made the films is that he's taken a little bit of every kind of religious tradition out there and kind of combining it together so that everybody, no matter what religion you are, or even if you don't follow any religion, you can still kind of relate to something in the story, because it's like a very common themes of having a mentor, having a teacher, trying to find yourself, like the original series. Luke, he knows that there's something greater for him out there, and he's trying to find it, and he comes across a teacher who helps guide him along the way. And it's very universal, basically. So thank you for joining us on the show. You wanted to get some input from someone like you who's a scholar and obviously a fan of science fiction and Star Wars as well.
No worry. Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
I'm tremendously honored. Well, so in my own work, my organization that I founded in 2018, Nostalgic Remembrance, I sort of look at three or really two main different areas. One is the sacred dimensions of the creative process. And that's sort of where I'm finding myself more and more inclined nowadays. And I find it to be sort of really at the heart of even looking at contemporary culture, where I try and look at the creative process as, and the creative process as it is experienced by any artist, regardless of their religious faith, regardless of their tradition, regardless of where they're coming from, as being something that is essentially what the Sufis might call a fath, a spiritual opening just for the lay person. That essentially the creative process is a fath with a lowercase f. It's the beginning, sort of like a smaller version of a mystical experience. And then what I've been doing, and I did this through retreats and so on and so forth. We had a retreat on Star Wars in December 2019, coinciding with the premiere of Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, where I do, reflections on contemporary culture. So we do, like things on Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, obviously, video games. We did a video game retreat in February, right before the pandemic outbreak, and so on and so forth. But the way I approach contemporary culture is I approach it specifically through Islamic metaphysics. So I approach it through the teachings of the Sufi mystic Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who for me was somebody who sort of bridged the gap between my own experience of Islam as a faith and popular culture. I intuitively knew of all of the spiritual motifs in Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, in video games, in Beatles songs, in John Denver, and all of this experience of life that I've had, and the deepest spiritual principles of our faith. So, and it's sort of like a conviction of mine that to really uncover or excavate deep realities in something like Star Wars, we do have to have some kind of metaphysical foundation. Like we can make, comparisons based on, like the Force is faith, and Yoda is the Sheikh, and Luke is the Seeker, and all of these are valid. But what is it about the Force being everywhere, right? It's all around us, as Yoda tells Luke in episode 5, in that famous scene where he's trying to train Luke to pull out his ship from the swamp, and Luke is unable to, and then and he says it is so big, and Yoda says, size matters not. Look at me. Does my size matter? Whereas my ally is the Force. It's all around us in the trees and the rocks. And then at the end, when Yoda pulls out the ship, Luke says, I don't believe it. And Yoda says, that is why you fail. So I think if we say, for example, that the Force is faith, then we have to, I think Star Wars makes us ask the question of our own faith. Do we really feel as though our faith is all around us? And what does it mean to say that Iman is in the tree? Right, so these are kinds of the deep questions that when I looked at Ibn Arabi, I found the answer for them. But before getting into the nitty-gritty of Star Wars, I think it's always powerful to sort of think about what the creator of Star Wars himself, George Lucas, sort of his motivation, his background. So George Lucas is a mentoree of Joseph Campbell, who is, of course, one of the fathers of the power, of the contemporary myth. He wrote The Power of Myth and The Hero's Journey, and there is actually an entire documentary with Bill Moyers where he interviewed Joseph Campbell, which eventually the transcript of that eventually became The Power of Myth. But Bill Moyers also interviewed Star Wars, at the height of the original films after they came out, and he asked him specifically, and he said, as many of us would ask him, he says, so what is the Force? Is the Force God? Is this what you're trying to the statement you're making? And he says, I'm less interested in religion and more interested in the question of God. And he said something really powerful. He said, I am more troubled when I ask young people, do you believe in God? He says, I am less troubled if they say no than if they say, I don't know. Right? He says, the fact that you never think about God, the presence of God in your life, that is more troubling to him, to George Lucas, than the fact that that you don't believe in God, which requires at least some thought process. It requires some time to reflect on the fact of whether you believe in a higher power or not. So George Lucas is coming from that background of Joseph Campbell, and I wrote an article comparing Joseph Campbell and Ibn Arabi. And one of the things about Joseph Campbell is that he was very strict in terms of what he thought the proper myth should be like, right? So he had very specific ideas. And actually in The Power of Myth, he says the myth doesn't exist anymore nowadays. And this is one of the few areas, and I think it's important for our conversation, this is one of the few areas where I mentioned in my article that Ibn Arabi is actually more expansive than Campbell. Because whereas Joseph Campbell says there is no contemporary myth, although he loved Star Wars, and he's recorded on video saying, yeah, it's perfect. It has all the parts. It has the student, it has the advisor, it has the villain, it has the complex, it has the climax, all of that. But Ibn Arabi says this world cannot exist without enchantment. So the enchantment is what's sustaining our physical world. Now, let's go back to the idea of the Force, right? And I guess we can begin from there. So when I read Ibn Arabi, I realized that he says there is two types of tawheed, right? Believing in God's oneness. One of which, and now we're going a little bit deep in theology, but I think it's necessary for understanding the Force. One of which is tanzih, which is believing that God is transcendent and independent from creation, right? This is like the verse of the Quran, "Laysa kamithlihi shay," right? There is nothing like God. He's completely independent and distant from creation, dissimilar from his creation. And the thing is that's how we tend to believe in God. Not only Muslims, I think also it's like a thing for monotheisms nowadays. In Judaism and Christianity, we tend to believe that God is completely dissimilar to his creation. The problem with that, although it establishes God's transcendence, it does not establish intimacy between God and his creation. And art and creativity is all about, and by art I'm extending it to Star Wars and Marvel, the superhero genre, it's all about establishing intimacy between the human sphere and the supernatural sphere. So if you look at superheroes, even if you look at Luke Skywalker, right, what you're looking at is someone who looks like us, but they can do things that we cannot do. And this little bit here makes the superhero, in this sense, what we might call a barzakh, right? They are the meeting place between the spiritual world and the physical world. So Ibn Arabi deduces this idea of barzakh from the verse of the Quran in Surah Rahman, maraj al-bahrayni yaltaqiyan baynahum barzakhun la yabghiyan. So he says, just like on earth we have this barzakh, this meeting place between the fresh water of the rivers or the lakes and the salty water of the ocean, similarly the fresh water actually represents the physical world. The fresh water represents the spiritual world, and the salty water represents the physical world. So the barzakh in between them, in many ways the superhero is a barzakh between the physical and the spiritual world, because outwardly they look like they're from the physical world, but inwardly they're able to perform something that the rest of us in the physical world cannot. Well, why is this important? Why couldn't Luke Skywalker look like, I don't know, like an angelic form, right? Why couldn't he look like pure force? Because if he did, just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to Quraysh when they ask, why doesn't an angel come to us? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to them, well, if there were angels walking upon the earth, then we would have sent them an angel. But you are human beings. So if we send you an angel as a messenger, someone who doesn't eat, doesn't drink, doesn't sleep, doesn't marry, then there is no way for you to connect with them. There is no way for you to feel intimacy, human intimacy and relationship and friendship with them. And this becomes the power of the superhero. That the superhero, by focusing on their weaknesses and then witnessing their triumph through a journey, we're able to actually figure out our own myth. Right? And this is something that Steven Spielberg said. He said, the reason why I made movies like Jaws and E.T. or Extraterrestrial Encounters of the Third Kind is because I have fears of deep waters and what lives under the ocean, and I have fascination with outer space. And he says, when I make these movies, I am externalizing my fears. And I am no longer afraid when I see my fears in front of me and I share them with my audience. So what's happening when we watch Luke Skywalker go through the struggle from being, a little farmer boy on Tatooine who wanted to just find some power converters and eventually become the one who would bring balance to the Force, maybe if he is the answer to that. What we're seeing our own struggle go from mundane life to the possibility of doing something extraordinary. Ultimately, human beings, we just want to feel like our little life is meaningful in the grand scheme of things. That is what the other type of tawheed that Ibn Arabi talks about, that is what it provides with us, and that is tashbih, right? So tanzih is establishing the absolute transcendence of God and his absolute the fact that there is no need for creation. God is completely dissimilar from creation. And then you have tashbih, which is all about establishing God's similarity with the world, or his presence with the world, in the sense which is the foundation in the verse of the Quran, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. He is with you wherever you are. Or فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. That essentially is what Yoda was saying about the Force. The Force is all around us. So if you look at the tree, there is the Force. And the Quran is saying, if you look at the tree, there is the countenance of God. If you know how to look. If you know how to look. Now, the thing is that understanding of Tawheed, which is that truth in the highest sense, oneness, divinity in the highest sense is all around us. That is actually not a very monotheistic understanding of a personal God, and it's more like Confucianist, far Asian understanding. But, Professor Sachiko Murata, the wife of Professor William Chittick, she wrote a book called Sufi Gleams in Chinese Light, where she showed how two Chinese Muslim scholars, Liu Ji and Wang Taiyu, they adopted Ibn Arabi's teachings through a Persian poet from the school of Ibn Arabi, Abdurrahman Jami. And they took the commentary of Abdurrahman Jami on the Fusus, Bezels of Wisdom, Ibn Arabi's Fusus, in Persian, because they didn't know Arabic. And they took that writing and they were able to create a new Confucianist Islam based on Ibn Arabi's metaphysics and based on this idea of Tawheed, of Tashbih, where God appears to be one with the universe. Incidentally, Professor Toshihiko Izutsu wrote another book comparing Ibn Arabi's metaphysics to Taoism, which is really in many ways diametrically opposed to Confucianism, and yet you can find Ibn Arabi in both these traditions. So this is just one area where I think that we need these metaphysical ideas to understand, to really be able to ask the deeper questions about Star Wars, because Star Wars begs a lot of questions from us as people of religion. And this is one of them. If you're going to say that faith is the Force, then explain how the faith is all around you. And how do you, what ramifications does that have on justice? That's a huge question. And also in Tashbih, what does it mean? How do you deal with tyrants and dictators and Darth Vaders and Palpatines if you and Yoda acknowledges that they're part of the Force. They're ultimately part of the Force. And I just yesterday I finished my second playthrough through one of the best Star Wars games ever made, Jedi Fallen Order, and the whole journey of that game, it takes place between episodes 3 and 4. So it's like during the Age of the Empire. And the whole story is that Cal Kestis, he was a young boy during the Jedi Purge. He's now a grown-up man, and he's rescued by another Jedi, ex-Jedi, and she's trying to help him find the holocron, the Jedi holocron, which contains the list of Force-sensitive children in the galaxy, to save them, right? So they can rebuild the Jedi Order and fight the Empire. And at the end, he retrieves the Jedi holocron. But she asks him, she's like, what are you going to do with it now? He's like, well, I can rescue them, but I think their fate should be trusted to the Force. And he just slices the holocron with a lightsaber. And he's like, it's not my place to intervene. Because the idea is if he saves the children, he risks their safety and they might be captured by the Empire. So he's like, their fate should be trusted to the Force. And that's exactly what Obi-Wan Kenobi says to in the holocron that he leaves after the Empire and the Republic falls, the Empire rises, and you see it in that incredible cartoon series Rebels, Star Wars Rebels, where they open, the holocron, and Obi-Wan says, "This is Obi-Wan Kenobi of the Jedi Order." He says, "Sadly, the Republic and the Jedi Order has fallen in the rise of the Empire." And then he says something, actually, the first time I heard this, it made me cry. It actually brought tears to my eyes. He says, "Do not go back to the Jedi Temple. That age is finished now. That time is over now. Only trust in the Force. And in due time, a new hope will rise." Of course, A New Hope is the title of episode 4, which is when Luke rises. And in Star Wars Rebels, by the way, there is an episode later on where Obi-Wan Kenobi has another duel with Darth Maul. And he finally kills him. I mean, Obi-Wan is much older now. And Darth Maul figures out that Obi-Wan is there to protect the one who is to bring balance to the Force. Darth Maul knows that. So and they're meeting on Tatooine. And so Darth Maul asks him, he's like, "You're here to protect the one. He's the one to bring balance to the Force, aren't you?" He's like, "Yes." And then after he kills him, after Obi-Wan kills Darth Maul, he holds him. He's holding his arch nemesis. He's holding his enemy. And he's passing away. And Darth Maul, his last words to Obi-Wan, he's like, "May he avenge all of us." So this is Darth Maul. This is the one who killed Qui-Gon Jinn. But after this Thor journey in the dark side and the suffering, ultimately all things go back to the Force. And so his final thing is like, just protect this boy, because I hope he can avenge all of us. He can bring balance to the Force for all our sakes. And ironically, the antagonist in Jedi Fallen Order, she says the same thing. She says she turns out to be an ex-Jedi who was tortured by the Empire, and she became a Sith Inquisitor. And moments before she was killed by Darth Vader because she was too weak, she tells Cal Kestis, she says, "Avenge all of us." So yeah, that's a long-winded way for me to just say that we can see how much more than going from just saying the Force is the faith, Force is faith, to saying there are deeper questions that I think metaphysics can bring us to ask and answer.
Wow, that's pretty good.
Mashallah, there's so much to unpack there. I have so many notes that I was writing about that. I one clarification question: was Darth Maul not cut in half in Star Wars Episode 1? Is this an alternate?
He lives in the Star Wars, in the cartoon series Clone Wars. He goes insane for a short while, and then he has a brother, Savage Opress, who goes and finds him. And he finds an upper body of Darth Maul and a lower body of a spider. And he has gone insane. And then he brings him back. And then actually Darth Maul and Savage Opress try and retake the Empire against Palpatine. And Palpatine comes and kills Savage Opress, and he starts torturing Darth Maul, leading all the way to Star Wars Rebels, which takes place again between episodes 3 and 4. So Darth Maul definitely has a lot. You should watch Clone Wars and Rebels.
Wow, I had no idea. I thought once he was cut in half, I'm like, there's no coming back from that.
No, actually, the biggest role he played was not in episode 1. The biggest role he played was, to speak of The Mandalorian, the biggest role he played was the sack of Mandalore, which took place at the same time that episode 3 was happening. So episode 3, while the Republic was falling and Palpatine executed Order 66, Darth Maul was in Mandalore, and he was sacking Mandalore and destroying all of Mandalore.
Oh wow, that's pretty crazy. I was just gonna say, Yeah, I gotta go back and watch. I didn't really watch Clone Wars, the cartoon, so I gotta go and watch that. I watched a few episodes and I watched a little bit of Rebels too. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there. But I was gonna say Darth Maul, he looks straight up like the Shaitan though.
Who's that? Oh, Darth Maul.
Saying Darth Maul looks straight up like a Shaitan.
Yeah, well, there is they introduce a whole world, a whole planet called Dathomir in Clone Wars, and Dathomir plays a big role in Jedi Fallen Order, the video game. It's basically a planet, literally like a Sith planet, but they have force wielders who are witches, led by a lady named Mother Talzin, and her daughters, so she calls them, are called Night Sisters. They wield the Force, but they wield the Force in magic. And Count Dooku, who plays a huge role in the Clone Wars, the cartoon series, his apprentice in Clone Wars, her name is Asajj Ventress, and she's a Night Sister. And so Asajj Ventress, I think, goes to try and find she tries to go and find a disciple for herself, and so she goes to Dathomir, and that's where Darth Maul is from. Darth Maul is a Night Brother. And so she goes to find another Night Brother to make him her apprentice. It is just a huge story.
So we're talking about Sahar and like black magic and a planet of Shayateen.
Yeah, and ironically, because George Lucas, he gave the Night Sisters a Russian accent.
That's really funny.
Yeah. So the Empire are British, the Republic are American, the Night Sisters are what's it called? Are Russian, and all the smugglers and dirty people on Tatooine are Arabs. So that's
the moisture farmers on the desert planet. It's really profound. I mean, going back to I want to go back to a couple of the things that you mentioned. Number one, like you were talking about, even in this metaphor of comparing these forces in the galaxy to forces on geopolitics, there's no good or bad per se. And the deeper you go into the Star Wars universe, the more you see it. I mean, even just sticking to the first six, the Jedi, especially, I think you watch 1, 2, 3, you can see how Anakin gets essentially his trust broken multiple times, how he voices real concerns that we can identify with in our lives and gets dismissed again and again and again, and finally gets validated. And so you could argue, that ultimately the Jedi Order became this very oppressive and greedy in their own way order. And that ultimately led to their demise, that their own arrogance and their own greed led to their own demise. And yet these are supposed to be the good guys, right? On the other hand, so on the other hand, you have the quote unquote bad guys, the dark side of the Force, the Sith, and yet what he's offering to Anakin is, listen, like, family is important, and I see that you see that, and love is important, and I'm going to actually help you sustain your family and to feed your love. And ultimately, the Jedi were saying, love is an attachment, like complete extreme zuhud. They became religious fanatics, I think, at the end.
And ultimately, I think, as Rian Johnson, although he was criticized for what he did in The Last Jedi, I think it sort of, that episode brings to a climax the big question behind what happened in the prequels, which is what happens when a tradition becomes stifled by dogma, right? And it is unable to adapt to the world around it. I mean, the big elephant in the room in episodes 1 through 3 is how was Palpatine able to deceive the highest ranking Jedis in the council who came into his office every single day, and they could not tell that this is the Sith Lord. I mean, I just recently read an article that they could have even figured it out from his decor, from his color choice. He had reds and blacks and like devil statues all over the office. I mean, come on, what more? His robes were black and red. What more did you want in order to get a hint that something was weird? But I think the powerful thing here is that Palpatine is perhaps best described by the verse in the Quran where Shaitan says on the Day of Judgment, "Do not blame me, only blame yourselves. I had no power over you except I called you and you responded to me." And I think that the only power Palpatine had is the Jedi's own weaknesses. Like, it's their weakness to play the role that was given to them. I remember once Dr. Sherman Jackson, he said something really powerful. He said, tradition needs two things to survive. It needs constancy. It needs a sense of reference and anchor. But it also needs change. If tradition changes without an anchor, it's no longer tradition, it's something else. But if tradition is anchored and doesn't change, it's not going to survive, right? Mm-hmm. It is not going to survive. And I think Luke sort of, even though he didn't live during the Jedi Order, he sort of, figured out in The Last Jedi that no matter what he even could do by training Ben, his nephew, and trying to raise a new Jedi Order, that there is just something about the tradition itself in the way that it's taught that is not able to cope with the times anymore. And it doesn't matter how many times you repeat the same mistake, you're not going to get different results. Mm-hmm. And I think this is, you can ask, why was Luke so frightened by Ben? Well, because he's seeing his own father. He's seeing his own self. I mean, he was so close. You can get it from the color choice, because George Lucas was so conscious of the color choice that he gave to characters. So in episode 6, Luke is dressed in black.
Right.
I mean, he's this close. He's this close to jumping in. And actually, in the old canon, it was mentioned that after episode 6, Luke opens a dark Jedi academy where he utilizes the dark side of the Force to train Jedi, with the idea being that the only way you can lessen the attraction to the dark side is if you teach it, if you use it for the force of good to the new disciples, to the murids.
And that would bring the balance back, right? I mean, we're talking about the prophesized one bringing the balance back. You can't have balance if you're only using one side.
Exactly.
It brings to mind Carl Jung talking about the shadow self and how you have to engage with the shadow parts of your own self.
That's a whole. I mean,
engage with your dark.
What Palpatine says to Anakin, and he says to Ben in episode 9, that famous statement, "The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural." There is a statement by Ibn Arabi where he says, "From the darknesses of ignorance to the light of guidance, and from the light of guidance to the darkness of perplexity." And the Prophet ﷺ has a hadith where he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has 70,000 veils of light and darkness. If he were to lift them, then the light of his countenance would burn everything that is in existence. So darkness has a place in the way that everything around us work. Ultimately, for a metaphysician, for a Sufi master, for a mystic like Ibn Arabi, everything is rooted in God. And everything we see around us, we can talk in terms of stories. All protagonists, all forces of good are rooted in divine Jamal, in divine beauty. And all forces of evil, what we perceive as evil, what we perceive as darkness, is rooted in divine Jalal. Because what is divine Jalal? It's the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we are not supposed to embody. And this is a key point here. Some people misunderstand, what Ibn Arabi is talking about in Tawheed. And there is a famous story of a saint, a murid, who was studying with his sheikh, and his sheikh was telling him, everything in the universe is a manifestation of God. So this kid, he went to the desert and he saw a snake and he tried to grab it and it bit him. And then he was going to die, and then the sheikh came and was trying to heal him, and he was like, what happened? He was like, well, you said everything in the universe is a manifestation of God, and I saw a snake and I wanted to touch it. He was like, you idiot. Some of his manifestations are names of Jalal. Your adab with those names is not to entertain them, is not to engage with them. So just because everything around us is a manifestation of God, a lion is a manifestation of God. A lion is a manifestation of the name Al-Qahhar, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in a hadith Qudsi, Al-'azamatu izari wal-kibriya'u ridai. Greatness and pride are my garments. Whoever competes with me in them, I will break them. Right? So we are not supposed to embody names of Jalal. We are required to embody names of Jamal. What happens when a character does not embody names of Jamal and embodies names of Jalal? We call them an antagonist. Right? So Palpatine wanted power. He went through disciples quicker than cups of coffee. I mean, he went through Darth Maul, and then he went through Count Dooku, and then he went through Anakin, and he was ready to go to Luke, and then he wanted to get Ben, and he wanted his granddaughter, Empress Palpatine. He just didn't care, right? Because there was that insatiable appetite for power and pride, and that's what we call an antagonist. So look at this. Ibn Arabi is actually allowing us to ground story and myth squarely within Tawheed. And I think this is the power, again, of metaphysics. Yeah, I mean, there's many directions I can go, but I better stop talking and just leave it.
Right. And when I think about sort of these different aspects, like you said, the force is within everything. There is nothing that is not the force. And yet, if you're foolish, you could die. You fall off a cliff, you're going to die. That doesn't mean you're outside of the force. It just means you were foolish with the force. This idea of radical tawheed, and I say radical because it sort of forces you to think outside of the way maybe we think on a daily basis of tawheed, and really encapsulate everything. And to take a deeper look into this and ground it back into Star Wars, I went off, I did a little bit of research on the Salaf of the Jedi, so to speak. Who were the first, generations? That was the Jedi Order. And so this little red yarn of research took me to the planet of Tython, right? Where there's 40 days of darkness and there's 40 days of light. And during the days of darkness, they study the darkness. During the days of light, they study the light. But yet it is just same one planet. Right. And so we look at radical tawheed, or you look at the universe that we live in, and we always try to relate things to our lived experiences. It is all one, and it encapsulates the light and the darkness. And of course, Allah in his greatness, and I'm going to draw another similar to Taoism, because you talked about Taoism. The Tao that can be named is not the Tao. So the darkness and the light that emanates from the divine presence is not the divine. Allah himself is above any and all names and attributes. But these are just a means for us to understand him, the same way how studying either the light or the dark side of the force is a means of understanding that force. And so, I think a lot about stories. Like, why does Allah put so many stories in the Quran?
Not only does he put stories, he actually forces us to tell stories.
How so? What do you mean forces us?
It's a commandment. Tell stories. فَقْصُصِ الْقَصَصَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Tell stories. That is the medium of da'wah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to follow. Tell stories so people don't lecture. Just tell stories so that people might reflect.
Storytelling and narrative as a way of teaching. And so I had a conversation with Amir Suleiman a few years ago. We were talking about, interestingly enough, we were talking about the Marvel universe. And his sheikh is in Senegal. He's a Senegalese Sheikh Mahi, and he was telling a story one time. This was back when like movies had just sort of like emerged, and movie theaters were popping up, and sort of the religious and a lot of the very traditional folks were saying that this is going to lead to sin and so on and so forth. But a bunch of murids asked their sheikh, they said, what do we do? Like, here is this falsehood on the screen. Here is this new fitna in movies and stuff. And he said that actually every murid should watch at least one movie in their lifetime so they can get the perspective and understanding that if I can watch a movie and understand that reality is an artificial reality meant to tell me something, that they can then take it to the next level and understand that this reality is also an artificial reality that exists to tell us something, right? And so it's beautiful. So Amir Suleiman, he tells me, he says, so basically he says, I watch movies religiously. And sometimes I'll go to the movie theater and I'm just going there completely on my own just to watch it from this perspective. So we started talking about the Marvel universe, and he says, what's really interesting is that all of these superheroes, so-called superheroes, exemplify different aspects of the nafs. You have one who has a lot of wealth, one who has a lot of strength, one who has a lot of... And all of them at some point in time put themselves in trouble because their niyyah was not pure. And what's really interesting, he said that the only character whose niyyah was pure and completely untarnished was Thanos. And the dalil, the proof of this, is that when Thanos had completed his mission of destroying half of the life in the universe for the sake of preserving the other half, might I add, like, it's all about perspective, really. Preaching from the book of Sheikh Thanos here. But once he completed his mission, what did he do? He didn't go on another rampage. He didn't continue murdering. He didn't do any of that. He went to go and pursue the life of a simple Sufi farmer on a deserted planet. He didn't want to be found. Right? But the other superheroes, because of their superhero-ness and this ego-driven need to destroy what you perceive as the other, what you perceive as evil, actually drove them to go and find Thanos out, even though he was living in peace. Wadi Salam, he was in the Valley of Peace. He found peace inner and outer. So, so Amir talks about this, and going back to also the stories in the Holy Quran, the one way that the stories of the Prophet of all the prophets that are mentioned is described in a lecture that I was hearing one time, and the way he described it is basically these are stories, yes, but they're also blueprints. And they're blueprints for your soul. Because within your soul, there's a Fir'aun, right? And when you are approaching Fir'aun, you need to know who has already approached Fir'aun so you know what your approach is, right? Exactly. And in the same vein, it's like in your life, you will have periods of time where you are at the bottom of a well and you see nothing but darkness and depression and you're completely alone. How do you deal with those situations in your life? And you look back at the blueprint. Well, how did this divinely inspired character from this story, Prophet Yusuf a.s. deal with it? right? What kind of spiritual fortitude, what kind of lessons can we glean from that? So taking this metaphor now back to the Star Wars universe, and I'm going to end this with a question, actually, that I've gotten varied answers on this question. So, thinking of Star Wars as the blueprint of the soul, and for me, Star Wars is Anakin's story. Because I was born in 1991. The first movie that I saw was Phantom Menace, and so for me, Star Wars is Anakin's story, right? So here's a young guy, here's a kid, does cool kid stuff, and he gets whisked away, called to adventure, and so on. And as he's going through adolescence and actually experiencing very real and natural human emotions and desires. And he experiences this loyalty and trust being broken, all of these sort of ups and downs. And each of these things are things that we have come across in our own lifetimes, whether when we are younger or throughout our lifetime, these things come up. Moral quandaries. For example, let's say that you have an opportunity to take a job that will have haram in it. You might, for example, someone just offered you to be a wine merchant, let's say, and you have no other jobs available to you, right? It's like, are you going to dip into the dark side of the force just so you can feed your family? This is a very real human condition, right? And so when I think about the blueprint of me and my own temptations, and I think about, subhanallah, like all of the things that I've done in my life, and you get to this feeling of like, there's so many people who have done so many evil things. Where is the hope for the mercy of Allah? And that is when I think that no matter how many people, and Darth Vader has killed a lot of people. He has killed a lot of people in the Empire. But at the end, when he reconciles the trauma that was hurting him, which was ultimately about his children, his helmet is removed. And in my mind, I don't even remember the exact dialogue, what they say, because in that scene, in my mind, I'm hearing him say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. That right before he dies, Darth Vader takes off his helmet and reunites with the Force and does Tawbah. And for me, because I was, born in the 90s, and, mine is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's my Star Wars. For me, Star Wars is a story of Tawbah, ultimately. And that is why Darth Vader has always been this very complex, good, but bad, but vulnerable, but human character that appealed to me. Why I have so many Darth Vader decorations and paraphernalia in my life. So that being said, I'm going to ask a question, and Irfan, I'd love to know your answer to this question as well. Whose story is Star Wars? Is it Luke's story? Is it Anakin's story? Or is it someone else's story? Now that we've seen the newer films as well, whose story is Star Wars?
Yeah, that's a good question. I also think that overall, the story, if you look at the 6 original films, it is also a story about obviously Luke Skywalker, but also, like you said, Anakin. And I always go back to where they keep mentioning the chosen one in the story. And when we look at the prequels, 1, 2, 3, it's the story about Anakin and his, they were saying, at that time, hey, this is going to be the chosen one. Qui-Gon Jinn was saying that, and nobody was believing him at that time. But Obi-Wan took it on to follow his master and train him because he believed what his master was saying, even though he may not have totally understood it at the time. And we all know what happened. And I brought this up in the last conversation. Mustafa in Arabic means the chosen one, and Darth Vader is living on the planet Mustafar. So it's pretty obvious that here this is the chosen one. And like Abbas mentioned at the end of Return of the Jedi, he goes back to doing what he was supposed to do originally and fighting against evil and fighting against the dark side. And this is when you guys were talking, I was actually thinking about Malcolm X, the story of Malcolm X. Obviously we're in Black History Month right now, but if you look at his story, he grew up in a very bad environment, and he became like a very seasoned criminal, a pimp and a thief and all kinds of bad stuff, right? But when he was in jail, he got the chance to learn, and he found a mentor, and the mentor was not the perfect person, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but he had just enough knowledge to awaken the light side of Malcolm X, and he became the great leader that he became. And even though his teacher was not perfect, he, just like we're talking about, everybody has some good and bad in them. Nobody is 100% good and nobody's 100% evil. Everybody has a little bit of both. And he had just enough good knowledge to pass on to Malcolm X, and he eventually transformed himself, and he became like totally, in terms of Star Wars, he became like Darth Vader, and he got rid of all his evil and became a great leader and brought a lot of lightness to people.
MashaAllah. Just a few things. I think Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, and I actually heard this from my dear friend Sheikh Mendez, Sheikh Muhammad Adayanka Mendez. He told me that there is a book by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse where he says he actually instructs his disciples to watch the cinema of the Europeans because there are glimpses of reality in it. He says in this book. And the other thing that the way the Quran, so the word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses for stories is qasas. And there's a difference between qasas and qisas. Qisas are completely fictional stories. And the Quran does not tell qisas. The Quran tells qasas, which are true history. But the narrative style of the Quran is thoroughly embellished. So there is a tremendous use of metaphor, a tremendous use of parables. There is a complete distortion of the linear story style. So if you look at the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, in the beginning we see him in Surah Baqarah, we see an older man, a prophet who is leading Bani Israel away from Fir'aun. And then in Surah Taha, later on, we find a baby, we find his childhood. And even in those segments in the Quran where the story overlaps, we find different dialogues, slight changes in the words between one, in the same conversation, but the wording is different from one instance to the other. So all of that tells us that ultimately embellished stories, just because you're telling something that is true, you're telling something that is rooted in that has to be embellished in order to attract people and to attract the listeners. And I think so, like Abbas, you mentioned that the characters of Luke and even Marvel. Oh, you were talking about Sidi Amir Sulaiman. That all of the superheroes represent aspects of the nafs. If we consider Marvel to be, and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings to be our modern mythology, this is our modern contemporary Mount Olympus. This is where we go as the Greeks went to connect to the unseen. Then what we're really saying also, and it's not completely different than what Sidi Amir Sulaiman is saying, but what we're saying is that superheroes are ultimately manifestations of divine names. And we can perceive them as aspects of the nafs because they're really rooted in divine names. I remember once Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah, he was making this statement about the ancient Egyptian gods. He says that if you look at the ancient Egyptian gods, they're actually very close to divine names, like the Lord, their god Ptah. That's the name Al-Fattah. That is one of the, it's the ancient Egyptian language. It's part of the Syriac family. It's actually closer to the Syriac, which is like the grandfather of the Arabic language. So what we're really saying is that Greek mythology, which is the earliest form of mythology, Babylonian mythology, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that is really what is sustaining Joseph Campbell and what is sustaining Stan Lee and George Lucas and Tolkien and this entire paradigm. Greek mythology, not many people know this, but Ibn Arabi says that the Prophet Idris, alayhi salam, he is the father of philosophers. So Ibn Arabi says that the one who taught Socrates is actually the Prophet Idris, alayhi salam. And Prophet Idris is known in many traditions as Hermes Trismegistus, and Dr. Maximus, the original teacher. So there is this type of knowledge called Hermetic knowledge. And what we consider Hermetic knowledge is like astrology, the rotation of the orbits, horoscopes, alchemy, and semiology, like the way to affect change in the world through words, which is, of course, everything we see in these movies like Harry Potter and magic. All of this stuff, and I call it stuff, all of this stuff that we see around us. I was just watching WandaVision yesterday, and all of this is ultimately sacred prophetic knowledge. One of my major basic foundations in the work that I do is because I recently had a debate with someone who was like completely opposite myself, but I am completely convinced that the source of creative inspiration is one. It is something that Ibn Arabi calls the realm of imagination, alamul khayal, and the way artists and directors, artists in general, are translators. We translate that ineffable creative inspiration into something tangible. Based on the purity of the artist, our intention, our spiritual foundation, our connection to the divine, all of that stuff, based on our own purity, then the translation process can be pure or it can be impure. But the source of creative inspiration is one. And actually, Ibn Arabi is very blunt about that as well. He says that every human being with an imagination who imagines something, then their gaze extends into that realm of imagination. I'm quoting him literally. Their gaze extends into that realm of imagination, even though they might not know that they are doing that. They think that they are going somewhere else. So this is why I try and root all of these popular cultural epics like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings in the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. So for me, answering Abbas's question, what is Star Wars a story of? I'm more inclined to think that Star Wars is a story of the Force. I think it's a story of the Force appearing and manifesting in various forms. Appearing in the form of Anakin, and even appearing in the story of Palpatine and Darth Plagueis the Wise. Because we can say that, as the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِخَوَاتِيمِهَا, actions are by their conclusions. Everything that Palpatine did, all of everything all the misery that he unleashed on the universe, on the galaxy, ultimately culminated in the redemption of Anakin. And mentioning that scene that you mentioned about the Tawbah of Anakin, of Darth Vader. So what's amazing is that in the script, in the Star Wars script, throughout the script of episodes 4, 5, and 6, Darth Vader, his lines are written as Darth Vader. But that last line where he says, "My son, you already have," when he says, "I have to save you," and he says, "My son, you already have," that line, the character is Anakin Skywalker. So there is a reversion, right? There is a rebirth. Darth Vader is gone, and now Anakin is reborn.
A return or turning, literally a toba.
Yeah, a toba. And there is a whole series of episodes in the Clone Wars, and this is another reason why you should watch them, the cartoon series, where actually Yoda is put through a test. Imagine that. Yoda, out of all people, he has one more test to go through. And the one who puts him through the test is the spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn. So the spirit of Qui-Gon comes back and tells Yoda, "I have been able to connect, to remain alive through the Force. I can connect with disciples." And that's why actually Obi-Wan secluded himself, went into a khalwa on Tatooine, because Yoda told him, "Your master still has training for you." So he secluded himself on Tatooine to maintain his communication with Qui-Gon Jinn. But Qui-Gon tells Yoda, he says, "You still have unfinished training. And to do that, you have to go to a planet which is like the spring of the Force." And they actually take him to the planet Dagobah, which eventually he would do his seclusion there later on in episode 5. So what happens on this planet? Yoda goes there, and his major test, the final test that's remaining, is Yoda has to face evil Yoda. And he faces this dark, black, like Jinn-like figure of Yoda. And the most amazing thing about this is that as they're fighting one another, Yoda keeps rejecting the fact that this darkness is a part of him. He says, "I do not recognize you. I do not know you." And every time he does that, he gets beaten up. He gets beaten up by that darkness. And then at the end he says, "Recognize you I do. Know you I do. A part of me you are, but you have no power over me." And that is the moment when he's able to burn that self. Now, what is this all about? Again, saying that I think Star Wars is the story of the Force, that it's ultimately all about these characters, one after the other, one way or another, willingly or unwillingly. They become the medium of bringing balance back to the Force, just as they had brought imbalance to the Force. So Palpatine, after everything that he did, he was the medium through which Anakin became Darth Vader. And he was also the medium through which Darth Vader returned to Anakin. Because it was through his torture of Luke, that he was going to kill Luke, that he revived the heart of the Father in Darth Vader, and Anakin was reborn. It was actually Palpatine who did that. Palpatine is also the one who made Ben Skywalker realize who he is. And he made, what's her name? Rey recognize who she is, right? So Luke the same way. Luke went through this whole journey, and ultimately everything goes back to the Force. Only trust in the Force. That was the main advice that all the Jedi left to their murids, shall we say, after the Purge. Right before they die, they say, "Trust in no one but the Force. Only trust in only," because that's ultimately where everything is going back to. I mean, trust only in the Force translates to "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." And for Ibn Arabi, this is not about physical death. This is about, so in his salawat, in his dua, he says, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un fi kulli halin wa maqamin wa khatirin wa masdarin wa wurud." At every moment, the Force, all forms around us are returning to equilibrium.
There's a great relief, like a spiritual relief that comes from that. That no matter what happens, no matter what I do, no matter what life puts me through, ultimately we're all going back to the same place. The only difference is the route and the timing. That's, I don't know which route I'm going to take. I don't know how long it'll take to get there. But the relief that comes from knowing that ultimately the Force is everything and I'm just going to be one with the Force at the end.
And yeah, like Rogue One, I am one with the Force, and the Force is one with me.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
It's like at the end of the day, there is just the Force. Like لمن الملك اليوم لله الواحد القهار. That's it. It's finished. So this is why, for me, I believe Star Wars is the story of the Force. And the reason I do that, the reason I want to look at it that way, is because then I can find a place, a redemptive place for people like Palpatine. Because I think that if you just dismiss Palpatine as absolute evil, then it does not explain the fact that he was a catalyst in all of these various things that happened, right, that transpired. He was playing his role in the grand scheme of things, and ultimately everything, or like that song by Enigma, Return to Innocence, right? Like everything just returns to innocence.
SubhanAllah, that's beautiful way of answering the question, and I think that really reflects also your perspective of Star Wars, because you reference the Clone Wars, you reference the video games. Everyone has a different experience of Star Wars, and that depends on the context that they're coming from, but also how much of Star Wars they've actually consumed. There's so much. There's novels, there's movies, there's video games, there's TV shows. Not everyone can get to such a high status and a level of elevation to have understood all of the Star Wars universe. And I wonder if George Lucas himself even can, or if he's created something that has transcended him to a much, much higher level.
Yeah, because you have the old canon and the new canon, and it's a huge universe.
New directors and screenwriters and actors and his generation. So what's really interesting to me is also that the consumption of Star Wars is almost generational. So, within my own family, for example, of my dad, who was born in the 70s. And his first experience of Star Wars, and he was born and raised in Nairobi, Kenya. And so there is a scene in it becomes hard to distinguish which episode, because I usually watch them back to back, and so it's just a continuum. But there's a scene where there's some alien pilots. I think maybe it was in the fifth or the sixth film, but some alien pilot starts speaking in what sounds like, I don't know, alien talk. But it turns out that George Lucas had actually gotten those lines translated into Kikuyu, which is the second most widely spoken language in Kenya. And everyone there was going crazy over it. Everyone loved Star Wars because of that 5-second line.
That's crazy.
So this is my dad's experience in the 70s. And then, fast forward, maybe 20, 25 years. I am a young boy on the faraway planet of Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, where I'm living out my childhood. And we had something called compact discs. And my dad got his hands on a compact disc that had Star Wars 1, The Phantom Menace. And we booted it up on the computer and we watched it. Now, of course, we didn't have Netflix. It's not like you have a lot of compact discs. Of course, I watched the movie again and again and again and again. And my first introduction was Star Wars 1, Phantom Menace, but many, many, many times before I even moved on to any other films. Right. So my entire universe of Star Wars was Jar Jar Binks and Darth Maul. Which, the grand scheme of things, is a very, very interesting experience, right?
Oh, man.
So that I guess is maybe this is where my generation differs from my dad's generation, where 1, 2, 3, and when I say my generation, I think also I would say 90s kids, right? 1999 was Phantom Menace. 90s kids are growing up through the 2000s. 1, 2, 3 is what you're going to the theater to watch. And then 4, 5, 6 is like, okay, now let me get the history, or let me get the future, but in a chronologically historical version. Now my 15-year-old brother, for him it's 7, 8, 9 and Rogue One. And everything else is sort of like what came before. But also he's watched the Clone Wars, and so now Mandalorian comes out, and he's putting out all these references that go completely over my head because I haven't seen the Clone Wars.
Yeah, I mean, I was born in '84, so the first one I watched in theaters was also The Phantom Menace. In '99, and I hadn't really watched Star Wars religiously, so to say, until after episodes 1, 2, and 3. I had started watching 4, 5, and 6 a little bit before episode 1 came out. But I think also, like when those movies came out, what was it, 75, 77, and 80 or something like that? Those, I think I imagine that what really captured people when the movies first came out was just the tech at the time. It was ridiculous that anybody had done anything like that in those days. But to really build the universe, I think that probably took a good 2 decades. And I think that's why Lucas waited a good 20 years before he went ahead and did episodes 1, 2, and 3, because it gave enough time for the universe to saturate the imaginations of people and that they feel invested in it. And it was a double-edged sword because many people disliked what he did with the universe.
Especially with Jar Jar Binks, probably the most controversial character.
Yeah. I mean, Lucas is a genius storyteller, but he's also really, really intriguing and interesting. He has really, really odd ideas and things to do. I mean, there are some lines in the Clone Wars that me and my friends, we just sit and look at and we're like, this is like really dirty. Why is it in a cartoon series? Like, why is Lucas doing this? And the same thing in Star Wars Rebels. There are just things that are like, this is really weird. Like when you sit and think about it, it's just really, really weird. But we've taken it as, I mean, what's her name? Carrie Fisher had mentioned, that, jokingly, but I think it's a thing that, what kind of crazy, weird mind you have to make me dress like that in episode 6,
right?
And make me a slave of a giant worm. Right,
exactly. Or make her character literally make out with her own brother,
right,
like that was a very small detail that if that wasn't in the film, it wouldn't have taken away from the story at all.
No, it wouldn't have. And I think that there was an aura in those days, just things you could do that nobody would ask, well, why is that in there? And it's just like, it's just there, Now,
have you seen have you seen any of his previous films before the Star Wars?
I haven't. I know about them, but I haven't had a chance to see them. And I know he's a really eccentric filmmaker too.
Yeah, so the movie that sort of he came onto the scene with was THX 1138.
Yeah, I heard about. That's the one I heard about.
It's really strange. Not very big on dialogue, although he does use human voices almost as a sound designer and creates a soundscape, much like he does in the Star Wars universe, of like radio chatter and intercom chatter. And so he's actually really good at using human voice as a sound designer, but his dialogue is very wooden and usually delivered very flatly. And even in Star Wars, his dialogue is quite terrible, and that's something that he's known for. But THX 1138 was actually based on a short film that he made in film school. So there was a shorter version, and when he came out of film school, he created this production house with Francis Ford Coppola. It was a big deal by then, and I don't know if it wasn't for that combination, maybe George Lucas wouldn't have gotten his break. But the first film that they put out is THX 1138, which was a flop in many ways. but a cult classic with those who were able to watch it with a higher understanding and not watching it necessarily for recreation purposes.
Yes.
Given the cultural context as well, that this movie came out in the late 60s. Here's a guy from the Bay Area. This is where the psychedelic movement and the hippie movement is rooted. There's a lot of Eastern religious traditions that are being, passing through. There's Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism. That is just the craze of the day. And that is the context with which this film comes out. So there definitely were people who saw that film and saw that George Lucas is speaking about something higher, right? And then, of course, he learned how to add these layers of storytelling and characters and entertainment, so to speak, so that he could ultimately come out with Star Wars, which is something that was a lot more easily consumable by people, but still have that impact. And what's interesting to me is that some of those people who really enjoyed THX 1138 are part of a group that's referenced to as the Habibiyah.
Oh wow! Okay.
Are you about the Habibiyah at this time, late 60s, early 70s?
Yes.
So obviously the video is not going to be in the podcast, but I have here a record by the Habibiyah, If Man But Knew.
Wow.
And this record was pressed in 1972. And actually the photography is by Peter Saunders. He was part of that group in the early days. And on the back, you can see how they're dressed just like Jedi Masters.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's the Moroccan dress. Yeah, of course.
We've got, on here, Ian Whiteman, Medina's father, is one of these musicians. We have Conrad Archuleta, who goes on to become Hakim Archuleta. And so amongst this group of people, all the disciples of Ian Dallas, they're all this. Ian Dallas is the one who had taken them to Morocco, where they had found sort of the path. But Ian Dallas is sort of leading them through these different chapters of that the Habibiyah goes through. So in this specific chapter, he's fundraising for the book, The Way of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And he's fundraising to publish this book, and he tells his fuqara, they call themselves the fuqara at this time, that, we need to go and find some people with money that might be into Sufism. George Lucas seems to be one of these. Everyone, the fuqara were really into THX 1138, so they thought, okay, this guy might be turned on to Sufism. So they had actually sent a delegation from the Habibiyah to go and talk to him a couple of times. And this was Sidi Abdulaziz Redpath and Daniel Abdul Hayy Moore. Wow. So in these different conversations, and I think Joseph Campbell was there as well in these conversations, and so they talk about spirituality, about Islam, about Sufism, about their recent journey. I think it was in 1970-71 is when they went to Morocco, and then they went to Hajj January, February of 71, and then they came back, and they had these conversations with George Lucas, probably as production was starting or while production was going on. And so that's where I see like a direct influence in the dress.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's not just Sufi dress, it's specifically North African Sufi dress.
Yeah, and there's also statements that he had contacts with some of the Marids of Sheikh Nazim at the time as well, which I wouldn't be surprised of. I mean, ultimately, like for me, even if there was no direct contact with Sufis, the thing is, what makes tasawwuf important is that, like Sayyid Hussain Nasr said to me when I asked him about the importance of Ibn Arabi for the masses, he said when people see a mountain, they're attracted to the peak. And only if they're attracted to the peak might they go through the struggle of climbing from the base. And Ibn Arabi and Christian mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Hinduism, Buddhism, they represent the mountain peaks of their respective traditions. And they represent a universal type of knowledge that actually, remarkably, even though it's at the peak of the tradition, it's described in very simple and basic terms, like perplexity, imagination, oneness, truth, dark and light. All of traditions, despite the convoluted technical language that we find at the base of their mountains, ultimately at the peak, they get to this simple, childlike sense of awe. You're just awed by what you see. And that's why I think when we look at Star Wars, we see tasawwuf there. We see Buddhism there. We see Christianity there in the Immaculate Conception of Anakin Skywalker. It's so clear, right? And you find Jewish mysticism, you find the whole thing there. But I think that I have no doubt, of course, that Lucas had some kind of exposure to tasawwuf, but it's just the remarkable way that he was able to bring it all together in a story, such that it's not too artificial in the sense that, oh, this guy is supposed to be the Christian, this guy is supposed to be the Sufi, this guy is supposed to be the Jewish Kabbalist. No, it's just all mixed together in something that is breathing and lively and has a life of its own.
It's really brilliantly put together universe. I know that we can keep going on this topic forever. We can, the same way people marathon Star Wars, we can marathon discussion about Star Wars.
Oh man, yeah, and we haven't even talked about Mandalorian either.
Yeah, I know we didn't talk about that at all. I know that obviously we can have many more conversations about this. In regards to the podcast, I'm going to have trouble editing because I don't know which of these jewels to keep and which ones will make it to the episode. But I just want to thank you for coming on to the Artistic Foodies podcast. I want to thank you for your perspective and for giving us a lot to think about in the Star Wars universe, and really inspiring us to watch films from a different perspective and to watch the film of our own life from a different perspective. So I really want to thank you for this.
Thank you so much, CD. It's always an honor, and hopefully one of these days you'll invite George Lucas to your podcast, and I'll be joining in as well.
Imagine that. That would really be something.
If you have a Star Wars cuisine, then I think you'll come.
We had, funnily enough, this podcast is called Star Wars, Islam, and Bone Broth. We had, I don't know if you know Zeki Hassan.
Yes, I do.
So he was interviewed for the first part where we talk about Star Wars, we talk about Lucas and film and the film side of things a lot more. Yeah. Then we have you talking about the Islam aspect. Yeah. And then, of course, there's that one scene where Grogu drinks bone broth in The Mandalorian. Yeah. And because of that, I actually have a full-on interview with Chef Lisa of Mirchi Cafe, who's really big on health and nutrition and food. And so we talk about bone broth in the third interview. So I want to be weaving these three interviews together into the one episode to ultimately bring it back to food. And then bonus content at the end, I'll give a little recipe for bone broth for people man. So this is going to be an epic undertaking, and now the editing, the hard part begins.
Yeah, so here is some Star Wars dishes. Colo clawfish, I don't know what that is. Roasted pork.
Not pork. Pork.
The pork are these cute little animals on the planet where Luke Skywalker was secluding himself. Yeah, so you can have roasted pork. Thala siren milk, and I think that's the blue milk that is like really, really kind of weird. Anything from the cantina. From Tatooine. Portion bread. Deep fried Nuna legs. I'm not sure.
Where are you reading this from?
On Star Wars website, StarWars.com. Deep fried Nuna legs. I think we can just settle for chicken sliders for that one.
Yes, I can deep fry some chicken legs and call them Nuna.
Oh, Mailer Run fruit is a big deal in the Clone Wars. Like really, really rare fruits. Let's see, Jabba's Paddy Frog snacks.
No, I don't know why, but none of these seem to sound very appetizing to me.
Yeah, I know. All right, CD. It's always a pleasure.
Jazakallah khair, and give my love to the family and my salam to everyone.
Will do. Hopefully we get to see you soon. Inshallah.
Inshallah soon.
Inshallah. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.